The voicemail came in at 6:12 on a Thursday morning, while I was standing barefoot in my kitchen waiting for coffee and trying to remember whether I had emailed a client back the night before. I almost didn't answer because the number was unfamiliar, and at 39 years old, I had finally reached the stage of adulthood where unknown calls usually meant one of three things: insurance spam, school fundraising, or somebody trying to sell me a warranty for a car I no longer owned. But something in me made me pick up. Maybe it was the hour. Maybe it was the way the number had a local area code from Charleston, the same city I'd spent the first 18 years of my life trying to escape, and the next 21 trying not to think about too often. "Ms. Delaney?" the woman asked. Her voice was careful and professional, the kind of voice people use when they know they're about to rearrange somebody else's day. "My name is Paula Benton. I'm calling from Benton and Shaw. I represented your Aunt Evelyn Delaney. I'm sorry to tell you she passed away late Monday evening." I sat down so fast I nearly missed the kitchen chair. Aunt Evelyn, my father's older sister, the woman who used to sneak me hard candies during church and tell me not to trust men who polish their shoes too much. The woman who taught me how to make proper biscuits, how to hem a dress by hand, and how to smile at rude people without giving them the satisfaction of knowing they had reached me. The woman my father had not spoken to in 8 years. The woman I hadn't seen in almost 3. "She left instructions that I contact you personally," Paula continued. "There's a reading of the will on Saturday afternoon. She specifically requested your presence. There are moments in life when your body understands something before your mind catches up. Mine did it then." My stomach tightened first. My fingers went cold second. By the time Paula gave me the office address and the time and told me there were certain matters Aunt Evelyn wished to be addressed in person, I already knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, whatever had happened in Charleston, my father was involved. And second, if Aunt Evelyn had gone out of her way to make sure I was in that room, she had not done it for sentimental reasons. My name is Nora Delaney. And if you had asked me 2 weeks before that phone call whether I thought I would ever again sit across a mahogany table from my father while a dead relative's lawyer read out instructions designed to expose him in front of half the family, I would have laughed and told you I had outgrown that chapter of my life. I would have been wrong. By the time I was 39, I had built a life in Atlanta that looked stable from the outside and carefully defended from the inside. I worked as a senior fraud investigator for a regional bank, which meant I spent my days following paper trails, comparing signatures, noticing what had been moved, hidden, altered, or quietly siphoned off, while everyone else was busy listening to whatever story sounded the most convincing. I had been married once, briefly, to a man who believed apologies were a substitute for changed behavior. We divorced when I was 34, no children, 1 row house with a tiny fenced yard, a lemon tree I was deeply overprotective of, a life quiet enough that I could hear myself think in it. That quiet had taken me years to build. I grew up in Charleston in a family that mistook volume for authority and obedience for love. My father, Richard Delaney, owned 3 car dealerships, 1 boat he couldn't really afford, and an ego so polished you could practically see your own exhaustion reflected in it. My mother, Judith, had spent 35 years orbiting him like a moon that had forgotten it could leave. My younger brother, Colin, was the golden child because he was easy, charming male, and willing to repeat my father's opinions back to him as if they were revelations. I was the difficult daughter because I asked questions at the wrong time and had the irritating habit of remembering exact numbers after everyone else had moved on. Aunt Evelyn was the only person in that family who treated that quality like a gift instead of a character flaw. She never married, never had children. She ran an antique architectural salvage business on the edge of downtown and lived alone in a narrow 3-story brick house she had inherited from our grandmother and filled with things that looked ordinary until you learned their history. A brass hotel key rack from Savannah, hand-painted Charleston maps from the 1920s, crystal doorknobs and velvet-lined drawers. She loved old objects because they told the truth about the hands that had used them. "People lie," she once told me while wrapping a Victorian lamp base in newspaper. "Paperwork lies less, and old wood doesn't lie at all." My father hated that sentence, mostly because Aunt Evelyn applied it to him more than once. The split between them started publicly 8 years ago, though I think it had been growing underground for decades. My grandmother had died and left behind a coastal rental property on Sullivan's Island, the kind of place that had become absurdly valuable without anyone in the family quite noticing when it happened. The house had been in my mother's side of the family for years, and while the legal details were messy, the short version was this. Aunt Evelyn believed my father had pressured my grieving mother into signing away a larger share than she understood. My father insisted everything had been handled fairly. Aunt Evelyn called him a thief in front of 17 people at Easter lunch. He called her a bitter old woman with no children and too much time on her hands. They never spoke again. I left Charleston not long after that and kept my visits short enough to preserve what little peace I could. Aunt Evelyn and I stayed in touch by phone mostly. Birthday cards, Christmas calls, occasional texts that were never quite casual enough to be casual. Every now and then she would ask me a strangely specific question about forged signatures, beneficiary changes, dormant trusts, or how difficult it was to get copies of old bank records if you knew where to ask. I always assumed it was Evelyn being Evelyn, collecting information the way other women collected teacups. I started to suspect otherwise when I drove to Charleston for the funeral. The service itself was small, tasteful, and tense, in the way Southern funerals often are when everyone is pretending not to know who hated whom. Aunt Evelyn had arranged almost everything in advance. The church flowers were white hydrangeas and pale roses. The pianist played exactly 3 hymns. Her casket was closed. At the reception afterward, held in the courtyard behind the church, my father wore navy and shook hands like he was running for office. My mother stood beside him in pearls and grief. Colin showed up 20 minutes late in mirrored sunglasses and kissed my cheek like we were old friends who hadn't spent the last 4 Thanksgivings barely speaking. And then there was my cousin Elise. Elise was Aunt Evelyn's goddaughter, though not by blood. She was 31, sharp, and had worked in Evelyn's salvage shop since college. If Aunt Evelyn had trusted anyone besides me, it was Elise. I found her near the coffee urns, holding a paper cup with both hands, like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "You came," she said. "Of course I came." She looked over my shoulder toward my father and then back at me. "Good." That single word settled in my chest like a stone. Good. Not I'm glad. Not thank you. Good. What's that supposed to mean? I asked quietly. Elise glanced toward the crowd again. It means don't leave town after Saturday. I stared at her. Elise. She knew something was wrong, she said, so softly I barely heard her. For months, maybe longer, she didn't trust your father, and near the end she stopped trusting your brother either. She told me if anything happened before she finished putting everything in order, I was to make sure you got in that room and stayed in that room until the very end. My coffee suddenly tasted metallic. What happened? Elise swallowed. I don't know all of it. I know she found documents in March. I know she changed locks in April. I know she hired a forensic accountant in May and didn't tell anybody but me and her attorney. And I know she said your father had spent years assuming nobody in the family could read a balance sheet. For a moment, all I could hear was silverware clinking against catered plates and my father's voice floating across the courtyard, warm and false and perfectly calibrated for public grief. What documents? I asked. Elise shook her head. She wouldn't show me. She just said, if Richard tries to perform at my funeral, let him. Saturday will take care of Saturday. I looked at my father again. He was laughing. Actually laughing. One hand on the shoulder of a man from his Rotary Club, the other holding a bourbon like this, was a networking event with flowers. I had seen that laugh before. It was the laugh he used when he thought the room was his, when he thought everyone else was either too intimidated, too polite, or too tired to challenge him. It was the same laugh he used when I was 16 and asked why money from my college fund had been moved into one of his dealership accounts temporarily. The same laugh he used when my mother cried over the Sullivan's Island papers and he told her she was too emotional to discuss legal matters. The same laugh he used at my wedding rehearsal dinner when he made a toast about how Nora always did have a suspicious nature, as if my ability to notice contradictions were a family punchline instead of a survival skill. By Saturday afternoon, I was seated in Benton and Shaw's conference room across from 5 members of my family, and one man I had never seen before who turned out to be my father's accountant. That alone was interesting. My father sat at the head of the table before anyone told him to. My mother was on his right, pale and quiet. Colin was on his left, tapping a Montblanc pen against the conference folder as if impatience were a form of authority. Elise sat beside me. Paula Benton entered exactly at 2 o'clock carrying a leather file box and 3 sealed envelopes. There are rooms that feel normal until a secret enters them. This room had stopped feeling normal before Paula even sat down. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "Ms. Delaney left a standard will, but she also left a memorandum with supplemental instructions and a number of documents she requested be presented in a specific order." My father leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach, wearing the expression of a man preparing to endure minor inconvenience on his way to receiving something he already considered his. I knew that look too. Paula began with the ordinary items: a bequest to the Church Restoration Fund, a scholarship donation to the College of Charleston, specific jewelry pieces to 2 friends, the salvage business itself to a lease, along with the warehouse lease and inventory rights. At that, my father's jaw tightened slightly. Interesting again. Then came the house. And Evelyn's brick townhouse on Trad Street, appraised at just over $2.1 million, had been placed into a trust. The beneficiary of that trust was me, not my father, not my mother, not the Delaney family. Me. Silence hit the room so hard it felt physical. My father blinked once. Colin stopped tapping his pen. My mother turned to look at me with an expression I could not immediately read, somewhere between confusion and dread. Paula continued in the same calm tone. Ms. Delaney also left written instructions that Ms. Nora Delaney remain present while the final documents are reviewed, as she believed Ms. Delaney would be the only family member able to understand their significance without embellishment. Colin gave a short, incredulous laugh. "That sounds like Evelyn." "No," Paula said. "What comes next sounds like Evelyn." She opened the first sealed envelope. Inside was a timeline, a typed, dated, meticulously organized timeline of financial transfers, property movements, and account withdrawals covering the last 9 years. Names, dates, account numbers, scanned signatures, copies of cashier's checks, LLC filings, one suspiciously amended trust document. It was the kind of packet only 2 types of people ever create: someone preparing for war or someone who has already survived it and wants to make sure the evidence lives longer than they do. Paula slid copies down the table. I didn't touch mine right away. I was watching my father. The color had started draining from his face, but he was still trying to hold on to composure, still trying to look mildly annoyed instead of frightened. Colin grabbed the first page and skimmed it too quickly, which told me he was looking for his own name before he was looking for the truth. Paula folded her hands. Ms. Delaney retained a forensic accountant last spring after discovering discrepancies in distributions related to the Sullivan's Island property and several family investment accounts originally funded by her late mother. She instructed me to say the following, and I quote, "If Richard starts interrupting, read the June 11th section first." My father sat up straighter. "This is ridiculous." Paula didn't even glance at him. She turned to page 14. "June 11th, she said, details the transfer of $480,000 from the Delaney Coastal Maintenance Reserve account into a holding company controlled by Richard Delaney and later used as collateral for a dealership refinancing package. The authorization page bears Judith Delaney's signature, which Ms. Delaney believed was forged." My mother made a sound then. Not a word. Just a small, shocked inhale that seemed to collapse inward. My father's voice sharpened. "Absolutely not." Paula reached into the file box and produced a second document. Attached is the handwriting examiner's opinion obtained in July, concluding with high probability that the signature on the transfer authorization was not signed by Judith Delaney. Nobody moved. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the paper like it had reached across the table and touched her. My father tried to laugh, but there was no room left in the air for that kind of performance. "You can hire any so-called expert to say anything if you pay them enough." "I suppose," Paula said evenly, "which is why Ms. Delaney retained 2. Colin stood up so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. "What exactly is the point of this?" Paula looked at him for the first time. The point, Mr. Delaney, is that your aunt believed your father stole from your mother, manipulated estate distributions, and later used your own name on corporate filings connected to shell entities that received funds from family accounts. Colin went still. I felt Elise beside me stop breathing, and that was the moment I understood this wasn't just about the beach property from years ago. This was bigger, older, layered. Aunt Evelyn hadn't spent her final months protecting a house. She had been building a case. My father turned to Colin too quickly, which told me everything before anyone said another word. "Dad?" Colin asked. Richard Delaney, who had spent my entire childhood with an answer ready before the question was even finished, said nothing. Paula opened the third envelope. "This," she said, "is the final letter Ms. Delaney requested be read only if Richard Delaney denied knowledge of the transfers." My father's hand slammed flat against the table. "You are not reading another damn thing." Paula met his stare with the calm of a woman billing by the hour and utterly unafraid of rich men in expensive watches. "Yes," she said, "I am." And when she unfolded that letter and looked directly at me before beginning, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next was going to rip the room open so completely that none of us would be able to pretend we had come here for a normal will reading. If you're listening to this from somewhere far away from the people who taught you to doubt your own memory, I want you to know I understand exactly how strange it feels when the proof finally lands on the table. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with sirens. Sometimes it arrives in a lawyer's conference room, inside 3 sealed envelopes in your dead aunt's handwriting. Take care of yourself. Protect your peace. And if you want the rest of what happened in that room after Paula opened the final letter, stay with me for the next part.